So my daughter is getting ready to go to prom, and her dress is quite a bit too long, about 4 inches, so we need to hem it. So today I'm going to show you how to do a blind hem by hand if you don't have a machine that will do a blind stitch like mine will not. So I am stuck sewing by hand, so I'm going to show you how to do that step by step. So I have everything all laid out, and as you can see, I have everything clipped where I want it, and I found like a big flat surface on my table so that I didn't have to worry about the fabric bending. Since it is a silky fabric, it's a little more difficult to keep everything lined up and not rippling and all of that, which makes it a little more complicated. That's why I just put it on a flat surface. Everything's clipped really nicely. So, and then I'll just measure as I go to make sure that I'm not messing anything up or having anything move around. So I'm just gonna get my needle ready, and then I will show you how to start stitching this hem in a blind hem so you don't see it on the front of the dress. Okay, so I've got my needle all ready. I'm using a very small, thin needle because I want to be able to make really small stitches when I'm going through this front part of the dress into this existing seam. You can cut this off, and that way, like, especially if you're doing, like, if you have to trim off like 8 or 12 inches of something in order to hem it, you might want to trim it. For the purpose of this dress, it's a floor length gown, so it's the 4 inches isn't going to make a big deal, and at the end I'm going to press it so everything will hang really nicely. And the size of this hem looks rather large, but in the scope of a floor length gown, 4 inches isn't too obtrusive. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start on one end. I'm gonna work in this direction because I am right-handed. I'm gonna wanna work left to right. You don't have to. So if you're left-handed and it makes it easier for you to work from right to left, go ahead and do that. But for the purpose of this video, just the way that I sew, I'm gonna go from left to right, starting at this end. Now, one of the biggest struggles that I run into with my yarn is it getting like all tangled and knotted. I know some people have, like, they use thread wax or other tools like that to make sure that their yarn doesn't tangle, but I haven't really gotten into anything like that. So that is something that is an option out there, and it's something that I will probably check out at some point, especially if I have to keep hemming prom dresses. So I'm gonna make sure that the edges are perfectly matched. You don't want the edge of this to be overlapping outside. That's gonna do two things. It'll make it crooked, but it also just won't look very attractive to have this sticking out, because this side is a slit. So I'm gonna want those edges to be really flush so that when she's wearing the gown, there's nothing just odd looking sticking out. If you're doing a dress that is a continuous round, it, you know, makes it a lot easier if you don't have to worry about the edges of the dress, because everything just connects seamlessly. So that's really nice, but that is not the situation we're in. So since I'm on this double layer here where this seam comes in, I don't have to worry about poking through the front of the dress. So I'm gonna grab a decent amount of this top layer just to give it a sturdy foundation. And I'm gonna go through the top of this seam here. And I'm gonna pull the thread all the way through. And as you can see, immediately my thread starts to twist up here. And that can cause some, it can cause it to not entangle. So you're gonna wanna be pretty careful when you're pulling it through, just to kind of head off any problems. You can see already there's a big loop in my thread. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pull on this other side to try to straighten that out, because I don't wanna have this get super tangled. There we go. Finish pulling that through till I get down to this end here. And what I like to do, just to secure it, rather than doing like a double loop and having to worry about going through things later, I just thread back through the 2 strands of my thread. So once I get that through, then I'm just gonna pull it tight there. And then I'll go ahead and go through one more time just to make sure that there's a solid foundation for this hem. And again, I'm going through the top layer of the 2 layers where this is folded over to make the outside seam. I now have 2 layers of fabric. So I'm just going through that top layer so it's not coming through to the other side, just to create this nice corner foundation so that it doesn't easily get ripped and come undone. Okay. Now, I have the tail of this thread sticking up, and I mean, it's not that big of a deal, but I just want to make sure that this hem has a really polished look. So I'm going to be tucking this tail of thread underneath the fabric. And then when I do my next stitch, it will kind of just trap it in there so I don't have to worry about it coming back out. So I'm just gonna hold that down where I just stitched. And I want to do my stitches about a 1/2 inch apart, 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch apart, so that it's not too close together, but it's close enough that we don't have any big gaps hanging out on this hem that will be easy to step on or rip open with the high heel of a shoe. So I'm gonna just eyeball about a 1/2 inch, and then I can see the stitching of this fabric. I can see the rows, and what I want to do is I want to go through just one row, so it makes this a very tiny little prick in that outside fabric. And let me see if I can lower the camera a little so you can see that a little easier. Move this over so you can see it's just one row of the weaving of this silky material that I'm going through. So on the outside, I'll show you when we get closer to the end how that looks on the outside, so that it's not a big stitch. You don't want it to look like big huge stitches coming through, because you don't want it to be a really obvious hem. So that's why it's called a blind hem. Move this back up a little so that everything's in the camera. Okay. So once I've got my one row of weaving on my needle, then I'm gonna go just through the top part of the existing hem. And I'm gonna put the thread on the top side because I'm going to be wanting my thread inside of this loop. And that's how we're gonna make it run along the top of this hem as we go along. And I'm gonna be watching for any signs of tangling or looping like we see here. So I'm gonna give my needle a pull to rein in those loops as we go along. And that's exactly what I'm talking about right there. Okay, so now I want to make sure that this thread's going to pull along the top. So once I get it in this far, I'm going to put my needle through this loop and pull all the way through, and then I'm going to tighten down this loop. And you can see now I have a stitch running from the beginning to my next stitch right along the top of that seam. I'm going to move on another 1/2 inch down, and if you want to get really exact with this, that's totally fine. I'm just going to go ahead and keep eyeballing those 1/2 inches just so that they look symmetrical on the outside of the dress. So there again, I'm going through one row of the weaving, and then I'm going to go through the top of this hem. And I want to catch a little bit more of that hem than the outside of the dress. And it doesn't need to be, you don't want it to be going, you know, down into this part of the hem that's already there, but you do want it to catch enough of it that it's going to be sturdy. I'm going to go ahead and pull this through. And I just go ahead, I kind of guide it through just to make sure that it doesn't tangle, because getting knots out of thread is not my favorite thing to do. So once I get it down to like a finger size loop, then I'm gonna put my needle through the loop front to back, and that's how I'm gonna form that carryover along the top. And just tighten that up a little. We don't want it to ripple, but we do want it to lay as flat as possible along the top of this hem. So you can see there the stitches coming across and the little stitches at the top of the seam. So I'm just going to keep going. I'm going to keep making those 1/2 inch stitches all the way across. And then when I get to the end, I will flip it over so you can see what the outside of the dress looks like with the blind hem complete. All right, so as you can see, I'm making some good progress here. A couple of things to note when you're figuring out where you want to put your needle in through the outside layer of fabric. You want it to be just underneath the lip of the seam so that it stays straight along with your new hem that you're making, and it's going to be perfectly lined up with the top of this seam. And then if you just want to, put your thumb on the stitch while you pull, that does help. Just that little bit of leverage really helps to keep the thread straight and keep everything from moving around, because the last thing you want while you're trying to sew this straight hem that doesn't have any ripples is for everything to shift and move while you're trying to stretch it. So I'm going to go ahead and finish all the way across the hem, and then I will show you what it looks like so that you can see why it's called a blind hem and how it hangs and everything afterwards. So now we are going to iron it. Now that the stitching is done, I've checked to make sure that it's the right length and that it hangs like it's supposed to. So I'm going to just press this down to create a really nice edge at the bottom that's nice and flat, and then we will have her try it on and see how it looks for prom tomorrow.